I'm going to bring in Miss Elena Athwal. Miss Athwal holds an LLM from Harvard University and a JD from Ahmad bin Khalifa University, HBKU in Qatar. She's a research fellow at the UNESCO Chair of Environmental Law and Sustainable Development at HBKU and a research associate with the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, as well as the OG's Institute, Afevala University in Nigeria. Our expertise lies at the intersection of international, environmental, and energy law, focusing on climate justice, human rights, and sustainable development across the Middle East and Africa. And Ms. Athwal has demonstrated leadership at Harvard, serving with distinction in the Environmental Law Society and the Human Rights Law Journal. She also acts as the Global Media Officer for the International Law Association, a member of both the American Bar Association and the International Bar Association. Her research interests explore the critical nexus between energy, environment, and human rights. So ladies, gentlemen, please welcome Ms. Athwal. Ms. Athwal, the floor is yours. Thank you. So Ms. Elena, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for your patience. Would you please go to the next slide, dear Adenike? Thank you so much again, everyone. So I believe I gave you the agenda. So the next slide, please, Adenike. Thank you. So today I just wanted to talk a little bit about sovereignty over natural resources. It's a fundamental principle that is enshrined in international law, particularly for nations which are very rich in critical minerals and other natural resources. As we navigate the global shift towards a net zero future, often the challenge for resource-rich countries, especially in Africa, is to strike a balance between maintaining sovereignty and at the same time meeting international ESG and climate obligations. This requires a nuanced approach that safeguards national autonomy while also integrating into global frameworks for sustainable development. So today during my presentation, as we discuss ESG in natural resource investments, we'll also explore how these principles can empower countries to exercise sovereignty responsibly while driving inclusive growth and resilience in the energy transition. So today up on the screen, as you see, let's take a look at what ESG actually means, environmental, social, governance factors in the context of natural resource investments. So these three pillars are really essential for navigating the complexities of energy law and really essential for ensuring alignment with sustainable development and ethical practices. ESG is no longer sort of this peripheral concern. It's much more central in terms of fostering trust and stability in markets while driving the clean energy transition. So the three pillars are environmental, in terms of the planet. So the E in ESG centers around the do no harm principle. It emphasizes reducing negative impacts on natural resources, conserving biodiversity, and combating climate change. It also emphasizes compliance with international environmental agreements like the Paris Agreement, which are crucial for mitigating greenhouse gas emissions and fostering sustainable practices. Then we have the S for people. The social pillar goes beyond philanthropy to focus on meaningful community engagement, such as social impact assessments or community development plans. These are no longer optional, but rather integral to energy project planning. So these efforts ensure that local communities can benefit directly with particular attention to gender equality and inclusivity, as highlighted by international instruments like CEDAW, for example. Then we have the G, governance. The G pillar underpins ethical operations through compliance, transparency, and accountability. It also connects energy law with corporate governance by setting more stringent disclosure and reporting requirements, ensuring that companies uphold the highest standards of integrity in their operations. So in summary, ESG really drives sustainable development and serves as a barometer for investors and stakeholders, shaping the future of natural resource investments. The next slide, please, dear. So what are the sources of ESG obligations in natural resource investments? We have several global instruments that are very core, such as the Paris Agreement, of course, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and the UN resolution, which recognizes the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, and which also reinforces the obligations of both states and businesses to uphold environmental protection. But we also have regional instruments, and those pertaining to Africa in particular are the African Union's human rights-based approach to natural resource governance. So this particular resolution promotes the management of natural resources in a manner that maximizes their contribution to developmental objectives while upholding human rights standards. It influences how companies in the region approach resource extraction and infrastructure development. We also have the African Union's, the African Commission's 2023 resolution on business and human rights in Africa. So this resolution emphasizes the role of businesses in achieving the goals of Agenda 2063, including sustainable economic growth and ethical governance, and requiring companies to integrate human rights into their corporate strategies. So Agenda 2063 is really Africa's blueprint and master plan for transforming Africa into the global powerhouse of the future. It's the continent's strategic framework that aims to deliver on its goal for inclusive and sustainable development, and is rather a concrete, one might say, manifestation of the Pan-African drive for unity, self-determination, freedom, progress, and collective prosperity pursued under Pan-Africanism and the African Renaissance. We also have OECD guidelines, and then we have several European Union, like the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the CSDDD. Now, this has progressed significantly since its proposal. It was formally adopted by the European Parliament and the Council of the European Union on May 24th. And in terms of what exactly the implementation timeline is, member states are required to transpose this directive into national law within 2 years. So the deadline for them to transpose this directive would be May 24th in 2026. So it applies directly to large EU companies and certain non-EU companies operating within the EU, specifically those meeting defined employee and turnover thresholds. In terms of due diligence obligations, companies are mandated to identify and, where necessary, prevent and or mitigate adverse impacts of their activities on human rights and environment throughout their value chains. In terms of enforcement mechanisms, in terms of administrative supervision, member states will designate certain authorities to supervise and enforce compliance. And then there is also civil liability, for example, where victims can seek compensation. So there are other domestic instruments: France's duty of vigilance law, the German Supply Chain Act, the UK's Modern Slavery Act. So all of these types of instruments collectively shape how ESG principles are implemented in natural resource investments. So this slide shows you how ESG is integrated into business practices. So you can see here that in order to integrate ESG into corporate or business practices, it's required to embed these principles into the very DNA of energy firms. So this would involve restructuring decision-making processes, for example, to prioritize ESG goals, adopting new technologies that mitigate environmental harm, and elevating the well-being of effective communities. For example, energy firms would then have to ensure compliance with international agreements like the Paris Agreement in order to align with domestic laws, such as the European Union's Due Diligence Directive. Next slide, please. So in terms here, now that we're together, we're reminded of the critical importance of compliance and of adaptation in terms of integrating these ESG principles into natural resource governance, particularly during this clean energy transition. So compliance today, it's important that we don't see it as something that's rather static. We need to look at it more as a dynamic strategy that can address legal risks and liabilities effectively. So what would be effective risk management, for example? It would require a dual approach, process change and product change as well. So process change would be conducting human rights due diligence, impact assessments as preconditions for projects, establishing ESG competent boards to oversee ethical governance and sustainability targets, avoiding greenwashing by implementing credible ESG monitoring, reporting, and disclosure mechanisms, renegotiating restrictive contracts to reflect more modern ESG standards, and strengthening alternative dispute resolution or ADR mechanisms for these energy transition disputes. And then in terms of product change, upgrading products, business services, and procurement practices to align with business and human rights norms, BHR norms, and incorporating innovations such as low carbon technologies and sustainable resource extraction methods. So in particular for African nations and African stakeholders, some adaptation would necessarily involve strengthening domestic legal frameworks to align with international commitments, encouraging regional cooperation under initiatives like Agenda 2063, fostering green technologies and attracting ESG conscious investors. And tailoring capacity development would really be essential. For example, reskilling workers, supporting talent development, and empowering communities. Those would be the key to ensuring a just and equitable energy transition. So in conclusion, I think by embedding flexibility, innovation, and justice into these strategies, I think we can really achieve a more sustainable resource governance while also contributing meaningfully to global net zero goals. So compliance and adaptation are not just about following the rules, it's about creating resilient systems for the future.
Thank you so much, Elena, for the wonderful presentation.